Hey Guildies, Fletch here. Today I'm going to talk about what you need to get started to begin programming, to be a programmer. And it's very simple to be a programmer. Anyone can do it. Let's look at what the requirements are right here. All right. Had this pulled up somewhere else. Requirement number one, the ability to think critically and logically. So what this means is you can think critically and logically. There's really not a lot to it. It's essentially just the ability to think, the ability to research, to figure things out for yourself, and to essentially Google things. There's a lot of things that you need to look into to be a programmer, and some of the things, well, all of the things to actually learn programming, I'm going to start to try to talk about in this series. But the ability to think critically comes from learning things like math and science and other STEM fields, paying attention to your schoolwork, research, writing reports, and doing things like that allow you to learn how to think critically. Another thing that can teach you how to think critically is playing video games. Not all video games, but video games that have a lot of puzzles in them, doing a lot of puzzles. That's a good way to learn how to think critically and think logically. So the ability to think critically and logically is the utmost and possibly main, if not only, requirement, except that the ability to debug your code. You can't be a programmer if you're not programming, and the ability to run your code. Now, you could get a piece of paper and you could write down code on it, and I guess technically you could be a programmer, except that you're not a programmer unless you maybe give that to someone and then they interpret it and put it into a computer, have it compiled, have it interpreted and compiled by the computer, and then the computer runs it. If it never gets to that point where it's getting onto a computer, then you're not a programmer. So just writing it on paper probably isn't enough. So the ability to debug, at some point your code has to run on a computer or you're not a programmer. So number three, there is no number three. Those are the requirements to be a programmer. And in order to be a good programmer, or in order to be valuable to a business, there's probably a lot more you need to learn. You need to watch tutorials like these and watch other tutorials on how to learn programming. But the base to get started is you have to be able to think critically and logically, and you have to be able to debug, as in like run your code, make it do things. Debug can also mean if there's a problem, you're figuring out what's wrong with your code. But in this sense, I'm using it as just the ability to run your code. So at some point, you're going to need what's called an IDE in order to do this. Now, as a .NET developer, I use an IDE called Visual Studio. This is, a lot of people use Visual Studio Code, VS Code, and that's what this is right here. And you can use VS Code and you can write code in it, and you can install interpreters and compilers that allow you to run code from VS Code. What I use is Visual Studio, which is more of a full-featured IDE for mainly .NET development, but it can do Python, it can do C++, it can do F#, which is another .NET thing. It can do all kinds of other programming languages. It can do Java even. So I have an IDE. I'm not going to tell you how to install an IDE or which IDE to install. You could use IntelliJ if you're doing Java, or NetBeans, or you can use any number of IDEs out there. If you search for IDE, and if you do number one, the ability to think critically and logically, then you can do some research, find out what kind of IDE you want, and you can install an IDE. No matter which one you choose, though, you're going to have a place to type things, like a text editor, and it will have some kind of a debug button, a run button, a way to run the code or debug the code. If not, it will have a place to type run or debug or some other commands. And when you learn that IDE, you'll learn the commands when you learn the programming language. But I'm simply going to be using C#. I'm going to be doing some C# code in Visual Studio IDE in order to teach you how to become a programmer. So you have the beginning, and you have the IDE, and you learn things like something like that. Let's put capital A. So whenever you do programming, you, at the very lowest level, you're working with things called variables. And your variables, var, essentially means variable. And you have a name. You can name it whatever you want. My height. Cost. You can name the variable whatever you want, just like in math where you have x or a or b. You can name it and be as descriptive as you want to be. This is my variable I understand. And you can assign it a value. So here's a variable, here's a value, and then you can do something with it. Var some other variable equals 200. Var answer equals, let's change these back to something like age 1 and age 2. Answer equals age 1 plus age 2. And now I can debug my code. So I hit run or debug. It'll go through everything, and I can see by putting my mouse over it. I know it's small for this screen. I don't know how to make this bigger necessarily. It says 10. Age 1 is 10. Put my mouse over this. Age 2 is 200. I put my mouse over answer, 210, because I did age 1 plus age 2. And that is essentially programming. I made another video on what is a code, is what the video is called. What is a code? You should definitely go watch that video. It shows you the difference between just writing a code versus making a program. And I can do a short demonstration. Taxes. Account. These are codes. These are things that mean something. If I have perhaps a header that says age, location, age would be like 26, location is Los Angeles. These are codes. Now, if someone came in here and they were able to type whatever they want, like that can mean Louisiana, it can mean anything. But whenever somebody comes in and they say, okay, we're going to standardize this into a way that might be useful to a computer. This might be city, state. Okay, we're standardizing this information, and now this can only be 50, give or take a couple values. This can be an actual name of a city. This is going to be a number from 0 to 130 or whatever the biggest age is. If anyone were to ever come in here and put this in here, then they're not coding this sheet correctly. Now that's coding, but coding can be either a code, like a value that represents something, or it can also be an equation. So equals this plus this. And we can have the age of 10 in here and an age of 20 in here. And we have now coded some values and we have coded an equation in here. So here we go. Here's some codes. So this is coding. This is perfectly fine coding. You can actually use Excel or Google Sheets to learn a lot about mathematical programming and algorithms and logic. But once you get your IDE set up, then you can come in here and you can start using variables. And you can do more and more complex things that we're going to go over in future videos. So what do you need in order to be a programmer? You need the ability to think critically and logically, and you need the ability to debug, as in run your code. And you get this by installing an IDE, if not having a text editor that can interpret and or compile your code and run it. So there you go. I hope you like this video. I hope you come back for part 2. I'm going to try to keep these as short as possible and do little bits at a time, just like with my other videos. And I hope you like and subscribe, leave a comment. Talk to you guys later.